every Friday evening. Just as the sun began to disappear behind the hills of Maple Falls, an old blue pickup truck slowly pulled into the parking lot of Miller's Diner. The truck was nearly 30 years old. Its paint had faded. The driver's seat had been repaired more than once. But every Friday, without fail, it arrived at exactly 1600 p.m. The man behind the wheel was George Miller, 84 years old, a widower, a retired truck driver, grandfather of 3. He had silver hair, kind eyes, and the quiet smile of someone who had learned that the happiest people rarely talked about themselves. Linda, the owner of Miller's Diner, looked up as the little bell above the entrance chimed. She smiled before George even reached the counter. "Good evening, George." George tipped his old baseball cap. "Evening, Linda." "The usual." He nodded. As always. Linda didn't need to ask what that meant. For 35 years, George had ordered exactly the same thing. 1 bowl of chicken noodle soup, 1 turkey sandwich, 1 slice of homemade apple pie, 1 cup of black coffee, and then 1 more complete dinner, packed carefully into a brown paper bag. Always the same words. "Make the second one nice and warm." Linda smiled. "I always do." No one inside the diner thought much about it anymore. The regular customers had grown used to George's routine. He must save it for tomorrow. Someone once suggested, maybe he feeds his dog. Another guessed. George never corrected anyone. He simply smiled, paid the bill, left a generous tip, picked up the paper bag, and quietly disappeared into the evening. At home, his grandson Ethan often visited on Friday nights. 16 years old, curious, smart, always asking questions. One evening, as George walked through the front door, Ethan noticed something. "Yes, why do you always buy 2 dinners?" George carefully hung his jacket by the door, smiled, then answered with another question. "Have you ever noticed how different Friday nights feel?" Ethan frowned. "I'm not sure." George sat beside the kitchen window, looked outside as the last light faded. Monday, people are busy. Tuesday, they're working. Wednesday, they're tired. But Friday, he smiled softly. Friday is when people hope they won't have to feel lonely. Ethan looked confused. Who gets the second dinner? George stirred his coffee slowly. Someone who needs it. Ooh. George smiled. I usually don't know. That answer only made Ethan more curious. The following Friday, he decided to follow his grandfather. Without telling him, George finished eating, collected the paper bag, walked out of the diner. Instead of driving home, he turned toward the older part of town, past empty storefronts, closed factories, quiet streets lit by old street lamps. Finally, he parked beside a small public park. Ethan watched from a distance. George stepped out of the truck, holding the warm paper bag carefully in both hands. A man sat alone on a bench, perhaps 60 years old. His coat looked too thin for the cold evening. His shoulders slumped forward. He stared silently at the ground. George walked over, sat beside him. Neither man spoke for several moments. Then George gently handed him the paper bag. The stranger looked surprised. I can't pay you, he whispered. George smiled. I wasn't selling it. The man slowly opened the bag. Warm steam drifted into the cool evening air. His eyes filled with tears. I haven't had a hot dinner in 3 days. George simply nodded. Then, I guess tonight was the right night. The man looked at him. Why are you doing this? George stood slowly, adjusted his old cap, then smiled. Because no one should eat alone on a Friday without waiting for thanks. George quietly walked back toward his truck. Ethan remained hidden behind a large oak tree. His heart felt strangely heavy. He had expected something exciting, some secret, some mystery. Instead, he had witnessed something incredibly simple. His grandfather bought dinner for a complete stranger. On the drive home, George never realized Ethan had followed him. Later that night, George entered his workshop behind the house. He opened a weathered leather notebook. The pages had yellowed with age. He carefully wrote Friday, Fay 1, 826, Park Bench, a gentleman who hadn't eaten in 3 days. Then one final sentence. He smiled before I left. George gently closed the notebook, turned off the workshop light, and quietly whispered to himself, See you next Friday. Outside, the stars slowly filled the night sky above Maple Falls. Inside one small leather notebook, another quiet act of kindness had just become another memory. One dinner, one stranger. One Friday at a time. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Friday night. For days, the image stayed in his mind. An old man sitting alone on a park bench. A warm paper bag. His grandfather quietly walking away before hearing, "Thank you." At school, his teachers spoke about history, mathematics, science. Ethan found himself wondering about something much simpler. How many lonely people were sitting somewhere, waiting for someone to notice them? The following Friday, Ethan made another decision. He would follow Grandpa again. But this time, he wanted to understand. At exactly 6 o'clock, George walked into Miller's diner, just as he always did. Linda greeted him with her familiar smile. "The usual." George nodded. "And make sure the soup stays hot." Linda winked. "It always does." Ethan quietly slipped into a booth near the back of the diner. George didn't notice him. He was reading the local newspaper while waiting for dinner. Every few minutes, someone walking past stopped to greet him. "Evening, George. Good to see you. How's fishing been?" George always answered with the same warm smile, never rushing anyone, never making the conversation about himself. After dinner, he collected the second meal, stepped outside, and drove away. This time, he didn't go toward the park. Instead, he stopped outside the county hospital. Ethan parked farther down the street, watching carefully. Near the emergency entrance, a young woman sat alone on a concrete bench. She looked exhausted. Her hospital badge identified her as a nurse. Her shoulders slumped forward. One hand covered her face. George quietly walked over. "Long shift?" he asked gently. The young nurse looked up, startled, then nodded. 16 hours, she whispered. "I forgot to bring dinner." George handed her the warm paper bag. "I think someone packed too much food." He smiled. She laughed softly through tired eyes. "I couldn't possibly." George gently interrupted. "I insist." The young nurse slowly accepted the bag. When she opened it, warm steam rose into the cold evening air. Her eyes filled with tears. "My little boy," she whispered. "He'll be so happy." George smiled. "Then make sure you share the pie." She laughed. "I will." George tipped his cap, then quietly walked back toward his truck. Ethan remained frozen. Grandpa didn't ask questions, didn't expect gratitude. He simply noticed people. Later that evening, back at the diner, Ethan approached Linda. "Can I ask you something?" She smiled. "About your grandpa?" Ethan nodded. "How long has he been doing this?" Linda looked toward the empty booth George always used. "A long time." "How long?" She thought for a moment. "I bought this diner 35 years ago." He was already doing it. Ethan stared in disbelief. 35 years? Linda nodded. "Every Friday, without missing one." She smiled. "Not one. Even during blizzards. Even when George had the flu. Even after his wife passed away. Even after knee surgery. He always came. Always ordered 2 dinners." Ethan frowned. "But why Friday?" Linda became unusually quiet. She slowly dried a coffee cup with a towel, then looked toward the window. "I don't think," she said softly. "That's my story to tell." She smiled gently. "If your grandpa wants you to know, he'll tell you." Ethan nodded. He respected that. The following week, George surprised him. "Would you like to have dinner with me Friday?" Ethan smiled. "I'd love to." That evening, the two sat together at their usual booth. Chicken noodle soup, turkey sandwiches, apple pie, black coffee for Grandpa, root beer for Ethan. When dinner ended, George quietly looked at his grandson. "Would you help me tonight?" Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" George smiled. "My knees aren't what they used to be." Together, they carried the second dinner outside. This time, they stopped beside the old bus station. A college student sat alone with 2 backpacks, one beside him, one beneath his feet. He stared silently at his phone. George walked over, waiting for the next bus. The young man nodded. "Tomorrow morning. Long trip." "I'm transferring schools," he answered quietly. "I spent my last dollar on the ticket." George handed him the paper bag. "You'll need dinner first." The student looked shocked. "I can't accept this." George smiled. "Someday, When life is kinder to you. But dinner for someone else. The young man slowly nodded. I promise. As they walked back toward the truck, Ethan couldn't stay silent any longer. Grandpa, how do you always know who needs help? George laughed softly. But lonely people. They have a certain way of looking at the world. Ethan looked puzzled. What do you mean? George smiled. They keep looking around. As though they're hoping someone might notice they're there. Ethan quietly looked back toward the young college student. He finally understood. Grandpa wasn't searching for poor people, or homeless people, or hungry people. He was searching for lonely people. That night, George opened the old leather notebook once again. Friday, Fay 1827, young college student. First night away from home. He smiled, then wrote one more sentence. He promised to help someone else someday. George gently closed the notebook toward an old framed photograph of his late wife resting on the workbench. He smiled. I think you'd have liked this one. Outside, another Friday quietly came to an end. Inside, a promise made decades earlier continued. One warm meal, one lonely stranger, one small act of kindness that no one else ever noticed. The following Friday, snow covered the sidewalks of Maple Falls. The old diner glowed warmly against the cold evening. Inside, the familiar smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie filled the air. George sat in his usual booth. His old leather notebook rested quietly beside him. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Linda's words. 35 years. Someone had started this story. But who? And why? After dinner, George stepped outside for a moment to warm up his truck. Ethan remained inside. Linda quietly walked over carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She smiled. I suppose you're still wondering. Ethan nodded. About Grandpa. Linda looked toward the frosted diner window. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she quietly sat across from Ethan. Think your grandpa would forgive me. Some stories need to be told. She folded her hands on the table. 35 years ago. Your grandpa wasn't the man everyone knows today. Ethan looked surprised. He wasn't. Linda smiled gently. He was kind, but he was also broken. The words hung quietly in the air. Back then, George was 49. He had spent nearly 30 years driving long-haul trucks across the country. He worked hard, never missed a shift, never complained. Then, one winter morning, the trucking company closed without warning. Hundreds of drivers lost their jobs. George was one of them. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't know what came next. Money disappeared quickly. Savings became smaller every week. Applications went unanswered. Bills continued arriving. One Friday evening, George walked into Miller's diner. Not because he wanted dinner, because it was the only place warm enough to sit for a little while. He counted the money in his pocket. Just enough for one bowl of soup, nothing more. Linda looked down. My father owned the diner back then. He told me. George looked like a man carrying the whole world on his shoulders. George quietly finished his soup, paid the bill, and prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, someone called his name. Sir. George turned around. A woman about his own age smiled from a nearby booth. She wore an old green coat. Her hair was beginning to turn gray. Her face looked familiar, though George couldn't remember from where. She pointed toward the waitress. I bought you dinner. George looked confused. Already ate. She smiled warmly. I know, but I noticed you kept looking at the apple pie. George laughed softly, a little embarrassed. I suppose I did. The waitress placed a warm slice of pie in front of him, along with fresh coffee. George quietly shook his head. I can't let strangers spend money on me. The woman smiled. Then don't. Just promise me something. George looked at her. When life becomes kind to you again, but dinner for someone else. The diner became strangely quiet. George slowly sat back down, looked at the warm pie, then at the woman. What if I never see you again? She smiled. You don't have to. Keenness isn't something you pay back. It's something you pass on. George never learned her name. When he finished eating, she had already left. The waitress handed him his receipt. On the back, the woman had written only one sentence. Someone once helped me too. Linda looked at Ethan. My father kept that receipt for years. Ethan sat completely still. Grandpa really kept that promise. Linda nodded. The very next Friday, he came back. Ordered 2 dinners. And he's been doing it every Friday since. Ethan quietly looked toward the empty booth where George had been sitting moments earlier. 1 simple meal. 1 anonymous stranger. 1 promise. 35 years later, thousands of Friday dinners had been shared, all because 1 woman noticed. A lonely man staring at a slice of apple pie. That evening, as George and Ethan drove home together, the roads were covered in fresh snow. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan asked, Grandpa, has anyone ever thanked you enough? George smiled. Oh. They don't need to. Why not? George looked through the windshield, watching snowflakes drift beneath the headlights. Because wasn't trying to change someone's life. I was only trying to make one Friday a little less lonely. Ethan quietly smiled. I think you've done both. George laughed softly. Maybe. But remember, it's never the meal people remember most. It's the feeling that someone noticed they were there. Later that night, George opened his leather notebook. Instead of writing immediately, he reached into the back cover, carefully removed an old yellow receipt. Its edges were worn with age. The handwriting had almost faded away. When life becomes kind to you again. Buy dinner for someone else. George smiled, touched the paper gently, then whispered, I've been trying. He folded the receipt carefully, placed it back inside the notebook, then added 1 more Friday entry. Friday, Fay 1, 8/28, a young father working 2 jobs. He smiled before he left. George closed the notebook, turned off the workshop light. Outside, snow continued falling across Maple Falls. Inside, a promise made by a stranger 35 years earlier continued changing lives. 1 Friday, 1 meal, 1 quiet act of kindness at a time. Winter settled over Maple Falls. The streets were quieter now. Bare tree branches stretched across gray skies. The old diner's windows glowed like little beacons every Friday evening. Inside, George still sat in the same booth, still ordered the same meal, still asked for 1 extra dinner. But Ethan noticed something different. Grandpa moved more slowly. Getting out of the truck took longer. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. Sometimes he paused before standing, as though waiting for his knees to remember how to move. Everything all right, Grandpa? Ethan asked 1 Friday. George smiled. Oh, he chuckled. This old body just needs a little more convincing these days. Ethan smiled back. But your heart still outruns everyone else's. George laughed. I hope it always does. From that Friday on, Ethan stopped following his grandfather in secret. Instead, he joined him openly. Every Friday became theirs. Dinner together. A second meal. 1 quiet mission. At first, George chose who would receive the extra meal. Ethan simply carried the paper bag, watched, listened, learned. 1 week. They stopped outside the public library. An elderly woman sat alone beneath the bus shelter. She wasn't homeless. Her clothes were clean. She carried a grocery bag. But she looked tired, very tired. George whispered, What do you notice? Ethan looked carefully. She's waiting for the bus. George smiled. Else. Ethan watched again. She keeps checking her purse. George nodded. And she looks at the restaurant across the street, but never walks inside. George smiled warmly. You noticed. They walked over together. George greeted her politely. Good evening. The woman smiled. George held out the warm paper bag. My grandson and I ordered too much. She looked surprised. I couldn't possibly. George smiled. I've learned something. Food tastes better when it's shared. The woman accepted the bag. As she opened it, she quietly whispered, I skipped lunch, so I could afford my medicine. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected that. Back inside the truck, George started the engine. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan asked, How did you know? George looked through the windshield. I didn't. I simply noticed. He smiled. Most people are carrying battles you'll never hear them talk about. The following Friday, George surprised Ethan. This week, you choose. Ethan blinked. Me. George nodded. You've been watching. Now trust your heart. Ethan suddenly felt nervous. The paper bag seemed much heavier than before. They walked through downtown Maple Falls, past the bookstore, the bakery, the old movie theater. Many people hurried by. None seemed to notice the others. Then, Ethan saw him. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, wearing a grocery store uniform. Still carrying his name tag, he sat alone on a bench, holding a vending machine snack, looking down at the ground. Ethan stopped walking. George quietly smiled. What made you stop? I don't know. He just looks lonely. George nodded. Then let's find out. Ethan walked over. His hands trembled slightly. Hi. The young man looked up. Hi. Ethan held out the dinner. My grandpa and I thought you might like this. The young man stared at the bag. For several long seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, Today's my birthday. Ethan froze. My roommates forgot. My family lives 600 miles away. I was just trying not to feel sorry for myself. His voice cracked. I guess someone remembered. Ethan looked toward Grandpa. George simply smiled. The same quiet smile he always wore. As they walked back to the truck, Ethan couldn't stop smiling. I almost walked past him. George nodded. So did everyone else. Those words stayed with Ethan all weekend. The next Friday, something unexpected happened. Before leaving the diner, Linda handed George a small notebook. I found this. She smiled. George looked confused. What is it? A list. She laughed. Everyone you've helped. George quickly shook his head. No, I never kept count. Linda smiled. I know, but some people did. She opened the notebook. Inside, customers had quietly written stories over the years. The Friday George bought me dinner after I lost my job. He never asked my name. That meal reminded me I wasn't invisible. Another page. He gave my daughter soup while she waited in the hospital. She still talks about him. Another. George helped me 20 years ago. Last Friday, bought dinner for someone else. George slowly closed the notebook. His eyes filled with tears. I never knew. Linda smiled. You weren't supposed to. That evening, back in his workshop, George didn't write immediately. Instead, he sat quietly looking at the old receipt from 35 years ago. Then he opened his leather notebook. Friday, Fay 1, Adri 29 birthday dinner for a young grocery clerk. He paused, then added another sentence. Tonight Ethan chose. He noticed before I did. George smiled, closed the notebook, and whispered softly into the quiet room. I think the tradition will be safe. Outside, snow continued falling over Maple Falls. Inside one small workshop, a grandfather quietly realized his greatest legacy might never be the thousands of meals he had given away. It might be the young man who was slowly learning to notice the people everyone else walked past. Spring slowly returned to Maple Falls. The snow melted from the sidewalks. Cherry blossoms began blooming outside Miller's diner. Friday evenings felt warmer again. But George seemed a little weaker. His old blue pickup still arrived at exactly 6 o'clock. His smile was still there. His kindness hadn't changed. Yet Ethan noticed something. Grandpa now paused before opening the diner's front door. Sometimes, he quietly caught his breath. Need a hand? Ethan asked one Friday, smiled. I've spent 84 years opening doors. He chuckled softly. I suppose it's all right if someone opens one for me now. From then on, Ethan always hurried ahead, holding the door before Grandpa reached it. George never asked. Ethan never mentioned it. Love often speaks, without words. Inside, Linda greeted them as always. The usual. George smiled. 2 dinners. Every Friday, without exception. One evening, while eating apple pie, George suddenly stopped. He looked around the diner. Every booth seemed full. Families laughed together. Friends shared stories. Children colored on paper placemats. Then, his eyes rested on an elderly man sitting alone near the window. The man wasn't hungry. His plate was still half full. Something about him looked familiar. George quietly stood, walked over. Mind if I join you? The man looked surprised, then smiled, like that. For nearly 20 minutes, the 2 elderly men simply talked. About baseball, old trucks, their wives, the weather, the price of coffee. Nothing extraordinary, When George returned, Ethan asked, "Did he need dinner?" George smiled. "No. He already had one." "Then, why did you sit with him?" George looked toward the lonely man. "Sometimes the meal isn't what people are hungry for. They're hungry for someone to stay." Those words stayed with Ethan all week. The following Friday, George wasn't feeling well. His breathing had become heavier. His cough lingered. Anna, the family doctor, listened carefully to his lungs. "You should stay home tonight," she said gently. George smiled. "I've stayed home before, but never on a Friday." Anna sighed. She knew arguing would change nothing. "At least let Ethan drive." George laughed. "I suppose my truck deserves a younger driver." Ethan smiled proudly. "I've been waiting years to hear that." Together, they drove to the diner. George sat quietly beside the window, watching Ethan carry the second dinner to the counter. Linda noticed. "You're training him," she whispered. George smiled. "I'm simply letting him practice." After dinner, Ethan asked, "Where are we going tonight?" George looked out the windshield, thought quietly, then answered, "I don't know. Let's see who needs us." For nearly 30 minutes, they drove slowly through town. No one stood alone outside the hospital. Park was empty. The bus station was quiet. Finally, Ethan noticed a small bookstore. Its lights were still on. Inside, a young woman sat alone behind the register. She looked exhausted. She rubbed her eyes, looked at the clock, then quietly returned to shelving books. Ethan smiled. "I think we found someone." The George looked through the window, then nodded. "You noticed?" Ethan walked inside alone. "Excuse me." The young woman looked up. "Yes." Ethan placed the warm paper bag on the counter. "My grandpa and I wanted to bring you dinner." She looked completely confused. "You don't even know me." Ethan smiled, remembering Grandpa's words. "I don't have to." She slowly opened the bag. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. "I've been covering double shifts," she whispered. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." Ethan smiled. "Glad we stopped." Back in the truck, George looked at his grandson with quiet pride. "You didn't even look at me," he said. Ethan smiled. "I already knew what you'd say." George laughed. "I guess you've been paying attention." That night, back at the workshop, George opened the leather notebook. But instead of writing another Friday entry, he turned to the very last page, one that had remained blank for years. He slowly wrote a title. For Ethan, he stared at the page for a long time, then quietly began writing. "If you're reading this, then Friday belongs to you now. Don't worry about helping everyone. Just help one person. One meal. One conversation. One reminder that someone noticed they were there. That's always enough." George smiled, closed the notebook, then carefully placed it inside the top drawer of his workbench, right beside the faded receipt that had started everything. Outside, the evening breeze gently rustled the cherry blossoms. Inside the workshop, a grandfather quietly prepared for a day he hoped was still far away, not because he feared leaving, but because he wanted to be certain that every Friday, someone would still buy one extra meal. Summer arrived in Maple Falls. The maple trees were full again. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods. The sidewalks outside Miller's Diner were busy every Friday evening. Life continued, just as it always had, but George knew his own journey was slowing. The doctor spoke kindly that Tuesday afternoon. George listened quietly, never interrupting, never asking how much time remained. When the appointment ended, the doctor simply squeezed his shoulder. "Spend time," he said softly, "the people you love." George smiled. "I already know exactly where I'll be Friday." The doctor laughed through misty eyes. "I thought you might." That Friday afternoon, George dressed more carefully than usual. He wore the plaid shirt his late wife had always liked. He polished his old leather boots. He placed his favorite baseball cap on his head, then quietly looked at his reflection. Not bad. He smiled. For an old truck driver, Ethan arrived a few minutes later. He immediately noticed something. "Grandpa, you look fancy." George laughed. "A man should look respectable when he's taking his grandson to dinner." The old blue pickup rolled slowly through town. George watched familiar streets pass by. The hardware store where he had worked after retiring from trucking, the park bench where he had shared hundreds of Friday meals, the library, the bus station, the little bookstore. Every place held a memory. As they passed the town square, George quietly whispered, "Thank you." Ethan glanced toward him. "For what?" George smiled. "For letting me stay here long enough to call this place home." At Miller's Diner, the little bell above the entrance rang once more. Linda looked up, then stopped. For some reason, seeing George walk through the door that evening made her heart ache. She smiled anyway. "Your booth is waiting." George tipped his cap. "I was hoping it still remembered me." The regular customers waved as he walked by. Some greeted him by name. Others simply smiled. Few realized they were watching George's final Friday. Dinner tasted especially good. George complimented Linda's apple pie. "Twice," she laughed. "You've said that every Friday for 35 years." George grinned. "And I've meant it every time." When the meal ended, Linda quietly placed the bill on the table. George reached for his wallet. She gently pushed it back. "Not tonight." George looked surprised. "You've paid enough." Linda smiled. "Consider this my turn." George stared at her for a long moment, then softly laughed. "I suppose I know how that feels." Neither of them mentioned why. Neither had to. As Ethan carried the second dinner to the truck, George quietly looked around the diner one last time. The old clock above the counter, the faded photographs on the walls, the smell of fresh coffee, laughter, the familiar voices. Some places become part of your soul. That evening, they drove without speaking much. Neither knew exactly where to stop. Finally, they reached the river overlook on the edge of town. An elderly man sat alone at a picnic table, fishing pole beside him, untouched sandwich resting on the bench. He stared quietly across the water. George slowly stepped out of the truck. His knees protested. His breathing came harder now. Still, he walked over. "Mind if we join you?" The man smiled. "I was hoping someone would." George handed him the warm paper bag. The man looked confused. "I already brought food." George smiled. "I know. But sometimes, Lou, it's nice knowing someone thought about you." The fisherman slowly nodded. His eyes quietly filled with tears. "My wife," he whispered, "used to fish with me every Friday. This is my first summer without her." George sat beside him. Neither man spoke for several minutes. They simply watched the river, the breeze, the evening sun. Finally, George quietly said, "You don't stop loving them. You just learn to carry them differently." The fisherman smiled. "I think you understand." George nodded. "I do." As they walked back toward the truck, Ethan noticed Grandpa was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" George smiled. "Better than okay." He looked toward the sunset. "I think that was exactly where we were supposed to be tonight." Back home, George didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he walked slowly into his little workshop. The familiar scent of cedar surrounded him. The workbench stood exactly where it always had. He opened the leather notebook, turned to the final page beneath the letter for Ethan, then carefully wrote one last Friday entry. "Friday, Hay 1, 8030, an old fisherman, missing his wife. We watched the sunset together." He paused, then added one final sentence. "If this was my last Friday, it was a beautiful one." George gently closed the notebook, placed the faded receipt back inside, turned off the workshop light, then looked around one final time. The shelves he had built, the old tools, the family photographs, his late wife's rocking chair in the corner. Everything carried a memory. He smiled softly. "Good night." He wasn't speaking to the workshop. He was speaking to a lifetime. That evening, George sat on the front porch with Ethan. The fireflies danced across the yard. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. After a long while, George spoke. "Ethan. Yes, if you ever wonder whether one small kindness matters, remember something." Ethan looked toward him. George smiled. "You'll probably never know how far it travels." Those became the last words Ethan would ever hear his grandfather speak. At the time, they felt like another piece of Grandpa's quiet wisdom. Only later would he realize they were also a goodbye. Monday morning arrived quietly. Sunlight spilled across the front porch of George's little farmhouse. Birds sang in the maple trees. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the open windows. Everything looked peaceful. Exactly the way George liked it. Ethan pulled into the driveway just after 8 o'clock. He carried 2 cups of coffee. One black, one with cream. The way Grandpa always ordered them. He smiled as he walked toward the front door. "Grandpa, I brought breakfast." There was no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. George never slept late. Never. A strange feeling settled into Ethan's chest. He unlocked the front door with the spare key. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. A baseball game played softly on the television. George's reading glasses rested beside his favorite chair. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. "Grandpa." Ethan called once more. He slowly walked toward the bedroom. The door stood slightly open. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains. George lay peacefully beneath a handmade quilt. One hand rested gently on the Bible beside him. A faint smile remained on his face. It looked as though he had simply fallen asleep. After a long, beautiful life. Ethan quietly sat beside the bed. He reached for George's weathered hand, still warm from the morning sun. Tears slowly filled his eyes. He whispered, "Thank you." For every Friday, a news spread quickly through Maple Falls. The little town seemed to pause. The hardware store closed for an hour. The librarian placed fresh flowers beside George's favorite reading chair. The diner turned off its neon sign for the evening. Even the city bus stopped briefly outside Miller's diner. The driver quietly removed his cap. George Miller had never been famous, but somehow, everyone seemed to know someone whose life had been touched by him. The funeral was held that Saturday at the small community church. The sanctuary overflowed. People stood along the walls. Others waited outside. Michael, George's son, quietly looked around. "I've never seen this many people," he whispered. Pastor Daniel smiled gently. Kindness has a way of inviting people back. One by one, people stood to share memories. A retired police officer smiled. 20 years ago, I worked every Friday night. Mr. Miller brought dinner to the station, he said. Even police officers shouldn't eat alone. The congregation laughed softly. Next, a young mother stood, holding a little girl by the hand. When my husband was deployed overseas, I worked 2 jobs. Every Friday, someone left dinner outside my apartment. I never knew it was George. She looked toward Ethan. Now I do. Another man slowly approached the podium. His beard had turned gray. His clothes were clean, but life had clearly been difficult. Ethan immediately recognized him. The man from the park bench. The one Grandpa had fed months earlier. He smiled through tears. "I wasn't the first, and I certainly wasn't the last, but I want you to know, that warm meal wasn't what saved me. The fact, that someone noticed me, did." The sanctuary fell completely silent. After the service, Linda quietly walked toward Ethan. She carried George's old leather notebook, the familiar one he wrote in every Friday. "Think," she said softly. "He wanted you to have this." Ethan gently accepted it. The worn leather felt exactly as it had in Grandpa's hands. That evening, unable to sleep, he walked into Grandpa's workshop. Everything remained exactly the same. The workbench, the old hammer, the shelves, the smell of cedar. He sat in Grandpa's chair, placed the notebook on the table, and slowly opened the first page. There, written neatly across hundreds of pages, were 35 years of Friday evenings. Friday way 16 young waitress, saving for nursing school. Friday 204 truck driver, missed his daughter's birthday. Friday 731 widower, first anniversary without his wife. Friday 81 2 teenager waiting outside the hospital. Every entry ended almost the same way. He smiled. She laughed. They looked less alone. Page after page, year after year. No complaints. No praise, only quiet observations. Then, something slipped from the back cover. An old yellow receipt. Its edges had nearly fallen apart. On the back, a familiar sentence appeared. "When life becomes kind to you again, buy dinner for someone else." Ethan carefully turned the receipt over. Behind it, folded tightly, was one final letter. Across the front, Grandpa had written for Ethan. His hands trembled. He slowly unfolded the paper. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone home." Tears blurred the words. He took a deep breath. Continued reading. "Please don't spend too much time being sad. Old truck drivers aren't meant to stay parked forever." Ethan laughed softly through tears. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. The letter continued. "You once asked me how I always knew who needed dinner. The truth is, I didn't. I only looked for people who seemed forgotten." Ethan quietly closed his eyes. George's handwriting became slightly shakier. "The world has plenty of people doing big things. Never underestimate someone quietly doing one small thing every single week." At the bottom of the page, one final request. "Next Friday, order 2 dinners. Don't do it because of me. Do it because someone is hoping to be noticed. And if one Friday you can't find anyone, sit beside someone who's eating alone. Loneliness is often hungrier than an empty stomach." Signed simply, Love. Grandpa Ethan held the letter against his chest. He looked around the quiet workshop. Every tool, every photograph, every memory. Then he smiled through his tears. "I promise." Outside, the evening breeze drifted through the open workshop door. Inside, a promise that had begun 35 years earlier had just found new hands. The first Friday without Grandpa felt different. Maple Falls looked exactly the same. The streets were busy. The diner was full. The church bells still rang across town. Yet to Ethan, everything seemed quieter, as though the whole town knew someone was missing. At 5:45 that evening, Ethan stood beside Grandpa's old blue pickup. The truck keys felt heavy in his hand. He rested one hand on the worn steering wheel, then smiled softly. "All right, Grandpa," he whispered. "I'll try." The old engine rumbled to life. For the first time, it wasn't George driving toward Miller's diner. It was Ethan. Linda looked up as the familiar truck pulled into the parking lot. When she saw Ethan climb out alone, her smile became gentle. She met him at the door. Without saying a word, she hugged him. "I've been saving your booth," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Unable to speak, he sat where Grandpa had sat for 35 years. The booth somehow felt larger now, and much emptier. Linda walked over with a small smile. The usual. Ethan looked toward the empty seat across from him, almost expecting Grandpa to answer first. Then he smiled. Chicken noodle soup, turkey sandwich, apple pie, black coffee. No, root beer, and one extra dinner, packed carefully into a brown paper bag. When Linda placed the bag on the table, she quietly added something else. A folded napkin. On it she had written, "He'd be proud of you." Ethan carefully slipped it into Grandpa's notebook. After dinner, he picked up the paper bag toward the truck, then stopped. "What now?" he whispered. Grandpa had always known where to go. Ethan didn't. For nearly 20 minutes, he drove slowly through town. The hospital, the bus station, the library, the park. No one seemed alone. He smiled sadly. "Maybe I'm not ready." Just as he prepared to head home, he noticed an elderly man standing beside the river, looking at the water, holding nothing but an old fishing hat. Ethan parked nearby, picked up the warm dinner, walked over. "Good evening." The man smiled politely. "Evening." Ethan held out the paper bag. "I thought you might enjoy dinner." The old man stared at him. Then, his eyes slowly widened. He looked past Ethan, toward the old blue pickup. His hands began trembling. "That truck," he whispered. Ethan nodded. "It belonged to my grandfather." The man took one slow step forward. "George." Ethan smiled softly. "Les. He passed away last week." For a long moment, the elderly man said nothing. He simply lowered his head, then quietly wiped away a tear. "I was afraid," he whispered. "One Friday would come, and he wouldn't." Ethan felt his heart tighten. "You knew him." The man laughed softly. "Knew him. I owe him my life." They sat together on the wooden bench overlooking the river. The paper bag rested between them. "My name is Samuel," the old man began. 32 years ago, I lost everything. My job. My marriage. I spent weeks sleeping in my truck. Every Friday, I parked right over there, pointed toward an old gravel lot across the road. I'd watch families eating together, Then I drive away. One night, a man knocked on my window. Samuel smiled through tears. He held out a paper bag and said, "No one should eat alone on a Friday." Ethan quietly smiled. Those words he knew by heart. Samuel continued, "I thought he was only giving me dinner, but he gave me something else." "What?" Ethan asked. Samuel looked toward the sunset. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The river flowed quietly beneath the fading evening light. Then Samuel reached into his jacket pocket. He removed an old wallet. Carefully unfolded a faded piece of paper. It was an old diner receipt, yellow with age, almost worn through. On the back, the same familiar handwriting appeared. "When life becomes kind to you, buy dinner for someone else." Ethan stared at it. "You kept it." Samuel smiled. "Every single day, I still carry it, and every Friday, I buy one extra meal." Ethan looked surprised. "You do?" Samuel nodded. "So do my two sons, my daughter, and now, my oldest granddaughter." Ethan suddenly understood. Grandpa had never counted how many meals he gave away, because kindness didn't stop with the first person. It continued. And again, ripples across a quiet lake. Samuel looked toward the old pickup truck. "George once told me something." "What was it?" Samuel smiled. "Real kindness shouldn't end with the person who receives it. It should begin there." A tears quietly filled Ethan's eyes. He looked toward the sunset, then softly whispered, I'm finally beginning to understand." That evening, back in Grandpa's workshop, Ethan opened the leather notebook. He turned to the next blank page, the first empty page in 35 years. With careful hands, he wrote, "Friday Fay 1 Samuel." He reminded me that kindness grows when people carry it forward. Then, for the first time, instead of writing Grandpa's name, he signed his own. Ethan, he gently closed the notebook, placed it beside the faded receipt, and smiled. The story hadn't ended. It had simply found its next storyteller. 20 years passed. Maple Falls had grown into a thriving little town. New cafes had opened. The old hardware store had become a bookstore. Children who once rode bicycles through quiet streets were now raising children of their own. Yet every Friday evening, one tradition remained unchanged. At exactly 6 o'clock, people across town quietly ordered one extra meal. Some restaurants even placed a small sign near the register. It simply read, "Friday meal, no explanation." No advertisement, no names. The people of Maple Falls didn't need one. The tradition had quietly spread. The local pizza shop joined. The Chinese restaurant joined. The barbecue truck joined. Even the bakery prepared extra sandwiches every Friday afternoon. No one was required to participate. No speeches were given. No ceremonies were held. People simply remembered and quietly chose kindness. Ethan was now 36 years old, a husband, a high school history teacher. Every Friday, he still drove Grandpa's old blue pickup. The paint had faded even more. The engine wasn't as strong as it once had been, but Ethan refused to replace it. To him, it wasn't just an old truck. It was 35 years of love, still traveling through town. That Friday, a small voice came from the passenger seat. "Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart." 6-year-old Emma looked up with curious eyes. "Why do we always buy 2 dinners?" Ethan smiled. The same question, the same age, the same curiosity. He suddenly remembered asking Grandpa almost 20 years earlier. Instead of answering immediately, he reached behind the truck seat, pulled out an old leather notebook. Its cover had become softer with age. The corners were worn. Thousands of hands had turned its pages. Emma looked at it. "What's that?" Ethan smiled. "The most valuable thing your great-grandpa ever left me." She looked surprised. "It's not money." Ethan laughed. "It's much better." That evening, instead of rushing to find someone who needed dinner, they sat together inside Miller's diner. Linda had retired years earlier. Now her daughter, Rebecca, owned the restaurant. She still knew exactly what Ethan ordered every Friday. "The usual." She smiled. Ethan nodded. "The usual." After dinner, Emma climbed into the booth beside her father. The notebook rested between them. Ethan slowly opened the first page. There, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting, was the very first Friday entry. Friday, Fay 1. A man sitting alone in the park. He smiled before I left. Emma listened quietly. Page after page, Ethan showed her. A lonely truck driver, a tired nurse, a young college student, a widower, a firefighter, a little girl waiting in a hospital, an elderly fisherman. Every page ended almost the same way. He smiled. She laughed. They didn't feel alone anymore. Emma looked up. Did great-grandpa know all these people? Ethan gently shook his head. No. I simply noticed them. Emma thought carefully. Is that why we buy 2 dinners? Ethan smiled. Yes, we're not buying food. We're reminding someone. They matter. Emma quietly nodded. I like that. Just then, Rebecca walked over carrying 2 paper bags. I packed an extra dessert. She smiled. It's on the house. Emma looked confused. Why? Rebecca laughed softly. Because my mother used to tell me. Your great-grandpa taught this town how to share. As Ethan and Emma walked outside, the parking lot was full. Families laughed together. Friends greeted one another. Children chased each other beneath the streetlights. Emma suddenly noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a nearby bench. She held a small shopping bag. Her eyes quietly watched everyone around her. Emma gently tugged her father's sleeve. Dad, I think. She looks lonely. Ethan looked toward the woman, then smiled. What should we do? Emma picked up one of the paper bags. I think it's our turn. She walked slowly toward the bench. Excuse me, she said politely. My daddy and I thought you might like dinner. The elderly woman looked surprised. For me? Emma nodded. My great-grandpa says no one should eat alone on Friday. The woman smiled through tears. I lost my husband last month. This is my first Friday by myself. Emma quietly hugged her. Without saying another word, the woman closed her eyes, held the little girl gently, and whispered, Thank you. As they walked back toward the truck, Emma smiled proudly. She needed a hug more than dinner. Ethan looked toward the evening sky. He smiled exactly the way Grandpa once had. I think you're right. That night, back in Grandpa's workshop, Ethan opened the leather notebook one final time. The pages were almost full. Only one remained blank. He handed the notebook to Emma. What should we write? Emma carefully took Grandpa's old fountain pen. Her small handwriting filled the final page. Friday, Fay 2, 560. A grandmother. She smiled after a hug. Then she added one more sentence. Kindness doesn't grow old. Ethan quietly wiped away a tear. Grandpa, he whispered. You were right. One small kindness really can travel farther than we ever know. Outside, Friday evening slowly settled over Maple Falls. Inside homes, restaurants, hospitals, and quiet park benches, hundreds of people shared one extra meal. Many never knew where the tradition had begun. They only knew someone once showed kindness to them. Now, it was their turn. George Miller never became famous. He never appeared in newspapers. He never asked anyone to remember his name. He simply accepted one stranger's kindness and spent the next 35 years passing it on. His greatest legacy wasn't the thousands of meals he bought. It wasn't the old blue pickup or the worn leather notebook. His greatest legacy was teaching an entire town that changing the world doesn't always begin with something extraordinary. Sometimes, it begins with one warm meal, empty seat, one quiet conversation, one person willing to notice another. And every Friday, as the lights of Miller's diner glowed against the evening sky, George's promise continued. One extra meal, one hopeful heart, one act of kindness at a time. The end title every Friday, Grandpa bought one extra meal. After he passed away, his grandson finally learned why.